Okay, let's dive right into this explainer. We often think of our professional struggles, office politics, toxic partnerships, fighting over resources, as uniquely modern problems. But honestly, the fundamental human dynamics behind these issues haven't changed in literally millennia. Today, we're unpacking a 4,000-year-old story from Genesis chapter 13, featuring Abraham and his nephew Lot. We're going to see exactly how their ancient turf war translates into a brilliant, highly actionable blueprint for modern believers who are facing high-stakes career decisions right now.
To kick things off, I want you to ask yourself, how do you typically respond when a coworker tries to take credit for your work? Or say, when a business partnership turns totally sour over resources? Do you dig your heels in, fight for what's rightfully yours, or do you just walk away? Look, it is so easy to get caught up in the stress of a toxic environment. We get defensive, protective of our turf, and sometimes, let's be real, we even compromise our own values just to stay ahead in the game. But what if there was a completely different strategy, one that doesn't just resolve the immediate conflict, but actually sets you up for a much greater, lasting success?
Well, this brings us directly to Abraham pleading with his nephew Lot. He says, "Let there be no strife between you and me, for we are brothers." Now, to put this in perspective, at this point in the text, Abraham and Lot are essentially business partners running massive agricultural operations. They've just come out of Egypt, their enterprise is absolutely booming, but suddenly their respective teams, their herdsmen, start fighting. It's a classic corporate turf war, and Abraham's immediate response, he steps right in and prioritizes the relationship over the resources. Let's look at Section 1, the problem of prosperity, why we fight. We usually tend to think that fighting happens because there just isn't enough to go around, right? But the text reveals something incredibly counterintuitive. It wasn't a lack of resources that caused the fighting, it was actually their immense prosperity. It turns out the original more money, more problems was literally written in Genesis. The original Hebrew word used to describe their wealth actually means very heavy. Remember, just a chapter earlier, Abraham faced a severe famine, a huge test of faith. But this text suggests that abundant wealth is an even heavier spiritual burden. It's actually a bigger crisis. Why? Because wealth and corporate success can so easily become a snare. They tempt us to rely on our resources rather than on God, and that causes our hearts to narrow. The land literally couldn't hold them because their possessions were just too great. It's a really powerful reminder that if our hearts are consumed by material gains, even the biggest company in the world won't be big enough to prevent conflict.
Moving on to Section 2, resolving conflicts of interest, the strategy of yielding. So what does Abraham actually do? How does the senior leader handle this intense turf war? I mean, he has every right to dictate the terms. He's the elder, he's the one who brought Lot along in the first place, and he holds the original promise from God. But instead of throwing his weight around, he practices incredible self-sacrifice. He simply looks at Lot and says, "You go left, I'll go right." This is a radical move. He completely relinquishes his seniority rights and lets Lot choose first, valuing peace over profit. By willingly surrendering his rights, Abraham implements the ultimate conflict resolution strategy. He recognizes that clinging to material advantages just isn't worth damaging the relationship or compromising his spiritual testimony in front of a watching world.
Which brings us to Section 3, faith versus worldly vision, two perspectives.
When we're faced with a fork in the road, the way we evaluate our options reveals everything about our internal priorities. And this story brilliantly illustrates the stark contrast between walking by sight versus walking by faith. Lot lifts up his eyes and evaluates the well-watered Jordan Valley purely with worldly sight, looking for that immediate gain. To him, it looks lush, like the Garden of Eden, or like Egypt, representing a comfortable, prosperous, but highly worldly environment. He makes a pragmatic, seemingly smart business decision based entirely on what his physical eyes can see. Abraham, on the other hand, he relies entirely on unseen spiritual faith. He doesn't even look around until God specifically tells him to. He knows for a fact that giving up the best-looking land doesn't mean giving up God's provision.
Let's track Lot's descent here, because it's fascinating. What starts out as a simple, pragmatic business decision to climb the corporate ladder gradually isolates him from his spiritual foundation. Failure is rarely a single catastrophic leap, right? It's usually a series of subtle steps. First, he looks with worldly eyes, prioritizing material wealth over spiritual health. Second, he chooses selfishly, totally ignoring his uncle's kindness. Third, he leaves the place where God had called them. Fourth, he gradually pitches his tent closer and closer to Sodom, a city the text clearly notes was deeply corrupt. And finally, he settles right in the middle of it. Our source material highlights this as a severe warning. When we let worldly ambition drive our career choices, we often end up compromising our values step by step until we're fully immersed in a toxic culture that completely strips away our spiritual vitality.
Now, Section 4. Relinquishing immediate gains, the broader promise.
Let's pivot back to Abraham for a second. Now, on paper, it might look like he completely lost the negotiation, right? He gets stuck with the rocky hill country while Lot takes the fertile valley, but the spiritual reality is entirely different. Because Abraham yielded his immediate rights, God stepped in to offer him an infinitely broader promise. The very moment Lot leaves, God tells Abraham to lift up his eyes, not with worldly vision, but with spiritual vision. God tells him to look north, south, east, and west, promising him literally all the land he can see forever. The text beautifully points out that whatever we willingly give up for the sake of peace and faith, God personally compensates for. I love that. Abraham gave up a piece of a valley, and God gave him the entire horizon. It just shows us that when we stop frantically trying to manage our own career progression and instead trust God's timing, the ultimate reward far exceeds our immediate, short-sighted goals.
Let's look at Section 5, Finding True Spiritual Rest, the Altar and the Tent. This brings us to the ultimate spiritual blueprint for staying grounded amidst the corporate hustle. Like, how did Abram actually sustain this level of faith? How did he not completely panic when he just gave away the best real estate? Well, to survive the pressures of life, we really have to follow his lead here. After receiving God's promise, Abraham intentionally moves his tent to Hebron by the oaks of Mamre, and he builds an altar. Now, in the original language, Hebron means fellowship or union, Mamre means strength and richness, and the oaks symbolize deep rest. The tent represents a life detached from worldly permanence, and the altar? That represents a life of continuous worship in prayer. This is the secret. Abram could handle workplace conflict and release his rights because his true identity and his satisfaction weren't found in his wealth. They were found at the altar in Hebron. For us, this means absolutely prioritizing our daily communion with God over everything else.
So let's wrap this up practically. Here are the actionable steps you can implement today to transcend office politics and maintain your spiritual rest in literally any environment. First, yield your rights for peace. You don't have to fight every single battle. Sometimes walking away is actually the strongest move you can make. Second, value relationships over revenue. People matter way more than climbing the corporate ladder. Third, prioritize daily communion with God. Build your own altar of prayer before you even open your laptop or check your emails. And fourth, trust unseen promises over immediate worldly gains. Don't be like Lot, jumping at the very first shiny opportunity if it's going to compromise your spiritual environment. As we conclude this explainer, I want to leave you with a final thought to really challenge where your true priorities lie. What is the Sodom in your career? Are you slowly pitching your tent toward a toxic environment just for the sake of a better title or a bigger paycheck? Or are you willing to step back, relinquish control, and build your altar in Hebron? Remember, it's when you finally let go of trying to force your own success that you make room for a truly limitless, lasting legacy. Just something to think about as you face your next big career decision.